Hey everybody, I hope you guys are doing well at home. So this will be our first lecture as we do our online class here. We're covering right now kind of the time period when Truman was president. We'll get into Eisenhower a little later, then JFK as well, but that won't be today. We'll just be covering a part of Truman's time still today. I did think I'd try to keep it somewhat normal. I'm going to give you a this day in history. Now, of course, you might not watch this on March 30th, but the date I'm assigning for you to have watched it by is March 30th. So, this day in history, March 30th, 1981, Ronald Reagan was shot in an attempted assassination attempt. The bullet did pierce his left lung. Before he went into surgery, keeping his sense of humor, he told his wife, Nancy Reagan, "Honey, I forgot to duck." He also told the surgeons before they started surgery and before they put him under, "Please tell me you're Republicans." So that just tells you a lot about Ronald Reagan, who he was as a person. Interestingly, the person who shot Ronald Reagan, John Hinckley, unlike other presidential assassins, he was not put to death for his crime. In fact, he wasn't even put in prison. He was instead found actually insane. He was said to be struggling with and have narcissistic personality disorder. So he spent many years instead in a mental institution, a mental hospital. He was released in 2016 and now lives with his mother, where he still has to have checkups just to make sure he's doing okay. In fact, with that disorder, what really he was obsessed with the movie Taxi Driver. I've never seen the movie, so I can't tell you exactly what it's about, but I read about it. In it, the main character, who's a taxi driver, becomes convinced that he wants to assassinate the president. Because of that movie, John Hinckley, became obsessed with Jodie Foster, who was in the movie, so he kind of wanted to live out his life like that movie was his reality. So clearly had some mental issues. Also on this day in history, 1867, Seward's Folly. You guys know this one. William Seward purchased Alaska from Russia. He was Secretary of State at that point in time. It was considered a mistake, but now obviously we look back and it was an important moment and a very good move by William Seward. This day in history, 1855, the first elections in Kansas Territory were disrupted by violence. So 5,000 border ruffians, pro-slavery men from Missouri came into Kansas. They intimidated, used violence to force the election of a pro-slavery legislature. In fact, there were more votes cast than the amount of voters. That's true voter fraud right there. That's truly corrupt politics. This day in history's birthdays, so March 30th, Vincent van Gogh, famous artist. Eric Clapton, famous guitar player and singer-songwriter. Robbie Coltrane, famous actor, well known for playing the character of Hagrid in the Harry Potter movies. Celine Dion, she's a divisive musical singer. She's got a lot of talent for sure, but people tend to either really like her or really not like her. She doesn't have a lot of people who are in between. Richard Sherman plays cornerback for the San Francisco 49ers. He played for the Seahawks before that. Our fun fact today: according to the CIA's 2013 data, the United States has 13,513 airports that are recognizable from the air, which is more than the next 10 countries combined. So not only does America have a lot of airports, we've got a lot of large airports. So much that the next 10 countries combined don't have as many as us. So we're going to continue with notes. And I say continue, this is something we haven't taken notes in weeks. So we'll kind of pick up where we left off. So I don't have this up here, but let me briefly, kind of recap. We're talking about the beginning of the Cold War. You had Winston Churchill give the Iron Curtain speech. We'll be referencing Eastern and Western Europe today and Eastern and Western Germany today. We had the Marshall Plan put forth by Secretary of State Marshall to give aid to countries in Europe to help them rebuild. They offered this aid to the Soviet Union and to Eastern European countries, but the Soviet Union obviously refused, and they forced the other Eastern European countries that were under their control to refuse as well. But Western European countries did take that. And that kind of leads us to where we are. Today, starting off at least, we're going to be focusing a little bit on Hollywood. Hollywood, after the war, was hopeful that the United States and the Soviet Union could remain allies. So, the Soviet Union and the United States, allies during the war. Many Americans, especially those in Hollywood, were hoping to continue post-war cooperation and peace between the countries. And no group of Americans were more dismayed at the divide that was coming between the Soviet Union and the United States than Hollywood itself. Now, the reason Hollywood, in some ways, at this point in time, there's a decent amount of communist influence during this time period. One of the reasons is the Soviet Union claimed to be anti-Semitic, and they claimed to, not be racist. And I will say this: you got to remember, in America during this time period, segregation still exists, which is a terrible thing. And the Soviet Union didn't technically have segregation. Now, I'm not going to say it was really good if you were another race of person in the Soviet Union. You might not be segregated. You might instead be sent to a prison camp. But the Soviet Union claimed not to be anti-Semitic, claimed not to be racist. And, the things that maybe were happening to people who were Jewish or of other races weren't well known. So for people who were in Hollywood, they felt the Communist Party was doing a better job of protecting human rights than the democracy in the United States. Which, like I said, in some ways, with segregation going on, there might be a little bit of truth to that. The Communist Party's chief Hollywood recruiter was Otto Katz. Write that name down. Otto Katz. K-A-T-Z. He was someone who recruited people to work in Hollywood. He said Columbus discovered America, but he also said about himself, I discovered Hollywood. He oftentimes would relate to Joseph Stalin as Uncle Joe. So, first question for you guys to answer, to make sure that you're watching this video: what did Otto Katz call Joseph Stalin Uncle Joe? So, write that question down. What did Otto Katz call Joseph Stalin Uncle Joe? He's like your family member. He's basically very pro-communist, very pro-Soviet Union, very pro-Stalin. I do think some of these communists don't realize how bad it is in the Soviet Union at this point in time. I'm not going to say all of them. Some might have a more inside track on what's really going on. Most of them were kind of naive to what was really happening in the Soviet Union. Famous actress Olivia de Havilland was known by millions of moviegoers worldwide. She played Melanie in the 1939 movie Gone with the Wind. Obviously, that's considered one of the greatest movies of all time. She was scheduled to give a speech in June of 1946, and a communist screenwriter, Dalton Trumbo, had written her speech, but she threw away the pro-Soviet part of the speech, and she delivered new lines instead, written by James Roosevelt's son, former President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who was an anti-communist. She read this speech, and she was then denounced by the Hollywood leftists. A young actor, Ronald Reagan, spoke on her behalf in defense of her, that she had a right to express her own ideas. However, Reagan was then denounced as a fascist scum. Okay, I'll come back to that in a second, but I want to ask a question. This will be your second question you have to answer for your assignment to let me know you watched this video. So the question is, when Ronald Reagan stood up for Olivia de Havilland, her name is right here, and her right to express her own ideas. So when Ronald Reagan stood up for Olivia de Havilland and the right to express her own ideas, what was he called? And the answer you want is fascist scum. So being called a fascist is not new. We hear Trump being called fascist. That's not a new thing. George W. Bush was called a fascist. But this is Reagan back in the 1940s being called a fascist. And at this point in time, Reagan is not a Republican yet. He's actually a Democrat, but he's not a communist Democrat. So he's standing up for the right to free speech, and he's being called a fascist for that. Soon, Reagan and de Havilland and other stars left the communist-dominated Hollywood Independent Citizens Committee of Arts, Sciences, and Professions. So let's talk about a union that was in Hollywood at this point in time period. It's called the Conference of Studio Unions, so CSU. Now, this didn't represent actors or actresses or even directors. This was primarily for people who were cartoonists, office workers, skilled film workers, people who oftentimes had lower paying jobs but worked long hours. They weren't the ones who getting their names in the headlines for the movies, but they were essential to the movie business. And they formed a union. It was under Herb Sorrell, who's not up here. But Herb Sorrell was a member of the Communist Party. It's not like he maybe was a communist. He was a member of the Communist Party. Well, they had a strike September 27th, 1946, outside of MGM Studios in California. And the cry of strikers was kill him, as they had just knocked down a deputy who was there with a bottle after he'd become separated from other police members. Sorrell would say he was not involved. However, he was flying in a private plane over MGM Studios, clearly inciting the violence by yelling commands at the union members on what they should do. So the People's Daily World, which was a communist newspaper, ran headlines such as "Blood flows as cops clubs picketing vets." So this is a communist newspaper. They clearly don't report the truth. They report that the communists were attacked by the police officers when it was 100% the opposite. In fact, none of the officers used clubs. None of the officers used violence, but the communists were acting violently against the police. Sorrell didn't apologize for the violence that was spurred. Sorrell was confronted by members of the Screen Actors Guild about his behavior, but he also demanded that the Screen Actors Guild demand and pay his staff, the people of this union, better because they were barely scraping by while the actors and actresses were making quite a bit of money. Ronald Reagan at this point in time was the president of the Screen Actors Guild. And Sorrell basically threatens and says that when this is all over, only one man will be running Hollywood, and it will be me. So Sorrell felt like he would be able to run Hollywood in the end. He refused to accept any responsibility for the problems. Well, this leads to problems, not just in Hollywood, but for laborized union. They don't want to be seen as promoting a lot of violence. So in 1946, the Republicans had just swept control of both houses of Congress for the first time since 1928. So Republicans now control the Senate and the House of Representatives. Labor unions kind of feared the worst because the Republicans were the ones who tended not to support labor unions as much as Democrats. It's the same today as well. Labor convened an emergency meeting in Chicago in 1946. The American Federation of Labor was there. Many actors came together to appeal to the AFL to reject Sorrell and his violence and the use of violence by the CSU. Long story short, tempers ran high, but the organized labor unions here rejected the CSU because they didn't want to be seen as communists. They didn't want to be seen as inciting violence because the people who were running at this point in time, the American Federation of Labor, were not communists at all. Okay, so they didn't want to be tied to the labor unions in Hollywood, so they began to speak out against those unions in order to not cause so many people to get angry. As a result, the people in Hollywood who are not communists now gain a little bit of control. So the fight over communism doesn't end here with this meeting of organized labor, but Hollywood begins to use what is known as a blacklist to basically state that certain writers cannot find work because they have ties to Moscow or to communism. Now, interestingly, some people to this day sometimes are like, that's so terrible that they blacklisted people. The thing is, the communists were the first to blacklist people in Hollywood. There were communists who blacklisted people who weren't communist. Now it's kind of going back on them. Many of these writers also eventually began to be able to write in Hollywood again once they denounced some of the communism or once some of the pro-communist things died down in Hollywood. But there was a Hollywood blacklist at this point in time. Who knows? There might be a blacklist today. It's just not told. And who knows who's being blacklisted. Certainly Hollywood has a lot of control over what image they want to portray and what message they want to put out. into the public. So as this is going on, you also have the creation of Israel as a country. Obviously, with the Holocaust, a lot of Jewish people died, but there were a lot of Jewish people too who were, looking for a place to live, because many maybe had found temporary homes during World War II, but now they're looking for more of a permanent place to live. And in 1948, on May 14th, a new state is born. It is authorized by the United Nations and a group who were known as Zionists, which was a movement mainly of European and American Jews who sought nationhood for millions of children of Israel who had been exiled for 2,000 years. Okay, so Jewish people coming back to their homeland is what this was about. So Israel is created as a nation. They announced their own Declaration of Independence during this time period. Truman was very much in support of this, but he had to overcome quite a few objections, especially from his Secretary of State, Marshall. During a face-to-face meeting in the Oval Office, Marshall warned the president that recognizing Israel would endanger U.S. objectives in the Middle East. He said this would be an area that would be harder to maintain because this would anger 50 million Arabs by placing Israel in the Middle East. Now, I'm 100% for Israel being a nation, but Marshall is correct on that part. This definitely is going to anger the Arabs in the area. Truman's Secretary of State told him he wouldn't even vote for him as president if he recognized the state of Israel. So he's like, if you recognize Israel, I will not vote for you. So Truman was, however, pretty devoted to his cause. He had been part of this cause since its inception. Earlier, in a document that promised the Jews a national homeland in Palestine in 1917, Truman was a part of that when he was a senator. Now in 1948, Truman felt it was his time to honor his promise. Also, for Truman, this was also something that most Americans agreed with Truman on this. Definitely Jewish Americans agreed with Truman, and that would help him with Jewish voters. But he felt they deserved a home. He felt that they should have a home. One of Truman's favorite verses is from Psalm 137:1. It says, "By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down, yea, we wept, and we remembered Zion." And this is referencing the exile of the Israelites from Jerusalem, from Israel, when they were in captivity in Babylon, and that they longed to be back in Zion. They were weeping. Okay, so in referencing this, Truman is basically saying, I'm trying to right some of the wrongs that have been done to the Israelites, to the Jewish people in the past. And for him specifically, what had just happened, the Holocaust. This was kind of an answer to that situation. Obviously, this did cause a lot of problems because as soon as Israel was declared as an independent country, they were invaded by 5 Arab countries. And they had to begin fighting for their very life right from the get-go. Now, I do want to say this because this is a question I want you to answer in the assignment about the video. How long, so write this down, how long after Israel was declared a nation did the United States wait to recognize them? So how long after the establishment of Israel as an independent state did the United States recognize them? The answer I want you to give is 11 minutes. So Israel becomes a nation, and Truman, within 11 minutes, says that they are a de facto state. America becomes the first country to recognize the nationhood of Israel, and America still remains, today at least, one of the strongest allies of the Israeli people in the Middle East. Okay, so let's turn our attention back to, the war between the Cold War, as we call it, between the Soviet Union and the United States. So, through the post-war settlement, Germany was split into 2 parts. You had East Germany and West Germany. Now, about 2/3 of Germany was in West Germany and 1/3 was East Germany. However, the city of Berlin is in East Germany. Now you're like, but isn't there East Berlin and West Berlin? Yes. But this is an interesting thing. The city of Berlin was split in half into two parts, but West Berlin, the free part, was surrounded by East Germany. So on all sides was communism for West Germany. So because of that, obviously, it puts them in a pretty unique situation. The West is being supported by the United States, the British, and the French, and the East is being supported by the Soviet Union. As far as things go, the West is, having democracy, having free elections. The East is under Stalin's thumb. They were a totalitarian police state, and they were pretty much occupied by the Soviet Union. So on June 24th, Stalin concocts a plan to try to trap the United States and to try to basically make it to where West Berlin cannot survive. And hopefully his hope is that it will show that he's stronger and the Soviet Union is stronger than the United States, and also maybe put West Berlin completely under Soviet control. So what he does is he begins blockading and cutting off all rail and road traffic to the free city of Berlin, so the western part of Berlin, in the hopes that they cannot get supplies, hopes that they can't get enough food, they can't get enough clothing, they can't get enough things to survive. And his hope here is that he forces Truman to do one of two things. So for Stalin, the options, or at least the options that Stalin thinks America would have, is to do one of two things. One, line up your tanks, your bulldozers, make your way into the city, basically guaranteeing World War III. Basically guaranteeing that there actually would no longer be the Cold War, it'd be a real war. So close to the end of World War II, Stalin's pretty sure America's not going to do this. So his bigger hope, and what he really thinks probably is going to happen, is the United States is just going to be like, oh well, we can't really supply them, we don't want to take any risks, and we're just going to abandon those 2.5 million people in West Berlin. Okay, it was estimated, some of Truman's advisors came to him and told him that there was probably about 36 days worth of food left in West Berlin, about 45 days of coal reserves, and this is really one of the most ruthless efforts in modern times at mass starvation for a political purpose. Truman, however, refuses both of these choices. Truman instead decides to do what becomes known as the Berlin Airlift, that they would fly supplies in to Berlin to supply the people there. This would cost the lives of some Americans and some British pilots. Not for the most part, most of them were successful. But over a 9-month period, the United States and the British conducted over 277,000 flights, carried over 2.3 million tons of supplies into West Berlin. And it was very successful. In fact, so successful that the rations for each person in West Berlin rose and were actually better off after the Berlin Airlift. Like I said, nearly 100 U.S. and British servicemen, however, lost their lives to try keeping the Berliners free from communist control. Interestingly, there's no better comparison of communist versus free democratic countries than Berlin itself during this time period. Okay, East Berlin, it has no freedom. Things get terrible. In fact, once the Berlin Wall was broken down, that's not even built yet. Well, that'll be coming later on in this chapter. But once the Berlin Wall is built and it gets torn down in 1990s, there's still parts of East Berlin that were not rebuilt from World War II. They still had buildings that were crumbled, whereas West Berlin was prospering, their economy was going great. So West Berlin and West Germany does really well as a result of the help of the Americans, the British, and the French. East Berlin and East Germany do terrible this whole time, showing a very clear difference between communism and freedom. Really, honestly, that's the biggest difference. All right, so now let's talk about some issues as we go into the election of 1948. This is the last thing we will talk about today, is the election. So sorry if it's going a little bit long, but I want to get through a decent amount of stuff since we haven't met for so long. As the election of 1948 arrived, it should be pretty easy for Truman to get reelected. The economy was booming. It was rolling. America made up 6% of the world's population, what was producing over one half of the world's goods and services. So 6% of the population, 50% of the goods and services in the world. So the economy's booming. People are going to work. As men come back from war, this is where you get the baby boom. In 1946, many babies are born, and it starts this whole trend of families growing once again and becoming larger, which hasn't continued, but families grew. People started having more kids, and you had a baby boom. Although Truman tried to enact quite a few programs, like Medicare, he proposed it first, but it wasn't passed because the Republicans controlled Congress. He did, however, through the GI Bill, give generous allowances that provided for young married men to support their family while they went off to college on the GI Bill. While they had other veteran benefits, many of them started farms, bought homes, started businesses. So that's a big part of this boom, is that, I'm talking about the economic boom, although baby boom as well, I guess, is that the soldiers actually, this time, they come back from war and things get going really well for them right away. So you don't have any post-war depression, which kind of happened in World War I. Things kind of get back on track pretty quickly this time period. On top of that, foreign policy successes for Truman all around. The Marshall Plan, supplying Western Europe with money to help them rebuild, a great success. The Berlin airlift, a great success. You see foreign policy successes all over the place. We haven't even talked about General Douglas MacArthur. He had been kind of put in charge of the rebuilding of Japan, and he was kind of overseeing the administration there, and he did oversee war crime tribunals there. However, he was well liked in Japan. Japan began to build up quickly. Japan's economy recovered. MacArthur introduced women's suffrage, women's voting in Japan, educational reforms, a new democratic constitution in Japan. So Japan's doing well as well. So the United States is really doing well in the area of foreign policy. However, despite all these successes, very few people thought Truman had much of a chance to win re-election. We mentioned how he was very different than FDR, but I think that's part of it, just this image that he had, that he was a common simpleton. He wasn't. He actually was a very good politician. He understood things very well, very down to earth, but he would tell you what he thinks, and that's not something politicians typically do. So he was seen as probably someone who wouldn't win re-election. Within his own party, there's going to be a couple of people who split off. One is Henry Wallace. He's far left. He was the vice president under FDR for the first 3 terms that FDR was elected. But during the election in 1944, when FDR got elected to his last term, he chose Truman because there was a little bit of a falling out with Wallace, on top of the fact that he felt for re-election Wallace was going to make it harder for him to do, because Wallace had become more and more radical. He runs as president from the Progressive Party. He doesn't actually get a lot of the vote. I'm giving you that ahead of time. But it was thought that he would take a lot of support from states like New York, Illinois, and California, and that would help Truman. Help Truman. I shouldn't say help. It would hurt Truman and cause him to lose the election. It's actually been proven that some of the people running Henry Wallace's campaigns were actually known communists. Okay. Now, interestingly, Henry Wallace at this point in time agrees with them on a lot of things, but Henry Wallace later on does kind of move away from some of the far left policies that he had really supported. As you go into this time period, both parties see civil rights as a prime issue of what is going on for this campaign and what needs to be addressed. Now, you go about this different ways. Many people doubted the sincerity of Truman's support of civil rights. He represented Missouri, in a state where segregation was the law. He was the grandson of a Confederate veteran. His own mother was known that she hated Abraham Lincoln. It was said that she'd rather sleep on a floor than sleep in the Lincoln bed in the White House. She used the N-word, the bad N-word, to refer to black people in, actually Harry Truman did this sometimes too in private conversations. However, Truman did stand up for civil rights in some ways. He said that he was everybody's president, when some people from the South especially said he should not run, miscegenation, which means the mixing and the mingling of the races. He said, I'm everybody's president. That's what the Constitution says. I'm not the president of just one group of people. He also, through executive order, desegregated the military. Now, this is a thing that took a process of a long time to actually enact, but to make all military unions mixed between whites and blacks and not segregated. So like during World War II, at like Pearl Harbor, black people in the Navy can only serve as cooks. They couldn't serve as like the guys shooting the guns on the Navy ships. They were segregated. Now he's desegregating that. Now he did it through executive order because Democrats stood against him in desegregating the military. The Republicans wanted to do it, but he lacked the votes to get it passed in Congress, so he did it through executive action. It's also during this time period that you have Jackie Robinson break the color barrier in baseball. Now in 1945, Jackie Robinson signed a contract with the Brooklyn Dodgers organization. That's not the year he played for the Brooklyn Dodgers yet. The next season, 1946, he played in Montreal for the AAA minor league affiliation with the Dodgers, and by 1947, he played for the Brooklyn Dodgers. But this all happens during the time period that Truman is president. Continuing the theme of civil rights, you get to the Democratic Convention, and this is where the civil rights issues becomes a big deal. Hubert Humphrey, who was from Minneapolis, a young mayor from there, strong supporter of civil rights, felt like they must adopt a strong platform to support civil rights, a strong commitment to civil rights, if they were going to compete with Wallace in the electoral vote-rich states in the North and the Midwest, and also in California. He rose to speak. He appealed to Democrats to come together out from under the shadow of states' rights into the bright sunshine of human rights. However, he did offend the South Carolina Democratic Governor, Strom Thurmond, who walked out of the convention taking dozens of other Southern delegates. Thurmond then pledged to run for president as a candidate of the States' Rights Democratic Party, which also became known as the Dixiecrats. Okay, so a question I want you to answer on an assignment for this video. What was the nickname of Strom Thurmond's party? What was the nickname of Strom Thurmond's party? Let me spell Strom Thurmond for you. Okay, it's Strom Thurmond. For some reason I went 2 pages, that's why I don't see it. So Strom is S-T-R-O-M, Thurmond, T-H-U-R-M-O-N-D. Okay, so what was the name of Strom Thurmond's political party? Put Dixiecrats. Dixiecrats. D-I-X-I-E-C-R-A-T-S. Dixiecrats. Thurmond vowed that he would maintain racial segregation. Interestingly, side note, Strom Thurmond, if he did get his way, he would be demanding segregation for one of his own children, because it's been proven that he had a child with a black maid of his. So, yeah, nice, great person, great person, as you can tell. Obviously, the Republicans go into this and they see a chance to take the White House for the first time since 1933 when FDR won. Thomas Dewey, who I don't have up here, so another question to answer. Who's the Republican candidate for president in 1948? Who is the Republican candidate for president in 1948? Thomas Dewey, D-E-W-E, Why? He was a popular governor from New York, which at this point in time, New York still had the most electoral votes of any state. He had run for president in 1944 and lost, and he had done a lot of personal attacks against FDR. So this time around, he decides instead to behave as if he almost already is president already, not do so many personal attacks. However, this still led to the impression that he was pompous, stiff, and a standoffish candidate. So it didn't endear him to people once again. Truman goes out on the campaign trail across the Midwest and chugs ahead. He decided to throw away the prepared text speeches because he was much better speaking off the cuff. Because if he just spoke with words that were written down by someone else, he kind of came off as kind of flat and emotionless. But if he just kind of spoke from his heart, his speaking was better. People were delighted to hear him when he came to speak. He rode a train which was called Ferdinand Magellan, and they traveled 21,928 miles on this train in 1948. He attacked the Republicans, obviously, but he also scalded Wallace and his communists. Like I said, Wallace's campaign was dominated by communists who secretly were taking their orders from Moscow. So the headline in the Chicago Tribune, the early edition of the paper, said, "Dewey defeats Truman." Really one of the greatest embarrassments in journalism, in the history of journalism. We talk about fake news. Granted, they weren't trying to be fake or anything like that, make up a story. But this is just getting something flat wrong. So they reported early. They didn't wait for some of the votes to come in from other places. And they felt so strongly that Truman was going to lose that they ran and said that Truman lost. However, Truman won, and he actually won pretty easily. It wasn't that tough of a election for him. Truman had strong support amongst Ronald Reagan and most of the non-communist Hollywood left. Friends of Israel, or Jewish people in America, showed up and voted in strong numbers for Truman, and blacks. Many of them also voted for Truman because he had taken such a strong stand on civil rights. So here's the election map, and this will be the last thing we do for these notes. I realize this one's been pretty long. But you can see Truman actually wins 303 electoral votes. Dewey wins 189 electoral votes. Wallace, who was running once again as the Progressive Party, he only got 2.4% of the popular vote. Obviously, he didn't really stand a chance, and he didn't actually take that much away from Truman. Now, the Dixiecrats, under Thurmond, he only got 2.4% of the votes, but he did win 39 electoral votes in the Deep South. So these states here still wanted to vote for Thurmond. They were so staunchly for segregation still at this point in time in history. So that's it for today. Hope you guys are staying safe. Hope you guys are staying healthy. Look forward to having another one of these in a couple days. Signing off. See you guys.